The snow came in from the northwest on a Tuesday, the way bad weather always comes, without the courtesy of waiting for a man to be ready for it. We had been 11 days out of Durango, moving southeast along the high ridge above Hermit Creek, and the morning had been cold but clear enough that I had not worried. By early afternoon, the clouds were low and gray and moving fast, and by the time the first flakes found us, we were above 9,000 feet with no tree cover and the wind coming hard across the open rock. 14 days of food in our packs and $3.40 between us. That was the full count of what we had. The cold did not care. I pulled my collar up and kept walking. That is the only answer the mountains ever accept. My brother moved behind me on the trail, closer than usual, the way he does when conditions turn. He doesn't complain, and he doesn't slow down. He gets quieter and watches more carefully, and I have learned to trust what he watches for more than I trust my own eyes in hard country. He has always been that way, faster to notice a thing than to name it, which is more useful than most people understand. The ridge was slick. The snow was coming sideways now, wet and heavy, the kind that packs into the seams of your boots and finds every gap in a coat. We needed shelter before dark, and dark was maybe 2 hours off, and I did not yet know where shelter would come from. I was running the problem quietly in my head, the way a man does when he can't afford to let on that he is running it. Then my brother stopped. I turned back to look at him. He was standing at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the slot canyon that cut through the rock below us. A narrow thing, mostly in shadow, the kind of gap that doesn't show itself until you are right on top of it. The snow was filling his hat brim. He raised his hand and pointed, not saying anything, because that is how he points when he means it. Far down the canyon wall, 50, maybe 60 feet below the ridgeline, there were 3 cuts in the stone face. Pale marks, clean angled, still showing raw granite beneath the lichen. Not erosion, not animal. An axe had made those marks, deliberately, in a pattern. 3 cuts, upper left, lower right, upper center. I stood there in the blowing snow and looked at that mark for a long moment. My father had taught us that pattern when I was 9 years old, and my brother was 2 years too young to understand it yet. He used it on every claim stake, every timber he dressed, every trail he blazed through country he meant to come back to. I had not seen it in 18 months. I did not move for a long moment. The snow came sideways off the ridge, and the wind had a sound in it like something tearing, and I stood there with my brother's arm raised beside me, and those 3 cuts in the granite, burning into my eyes, like they were lit from inside. Upper left, lower right, upper center. My brother looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us spoke. The descent into the slot canyon took the better part of 2 hours. The walls were sheer in places, cracked and ledged in others, and the snow that had been falling all morning had filled every foothold with a thin layer that looked solid and wasn't. We used our hands more than our feet. My brother went first. He has always had a better sense of where stone will hold, and I followed the exact path he made, placing my boots where his boots had been, watching his shoulders for the small flinch that means a ledge is shifting. 600 feet, near enough. By the time we reached the canyon floor, my fingers were white past the second knuckle, and my shoulders ached from holding my weight against the rock face. The canyon was narrow at the bottom, maybe 30 feet across at its widest. The creek ran down the center of it, already skimmed with ice along the edges, the water underneath moving fast and dark over flat stones. The walls rose straight up on both sides, and the sky above was a pale strip of nothing. Sound moved strangely down there. The creek was louder than it should have been, and our own breathing came back to us off the rock. My brother saw it first. Again, he is better at looking. It was built into the east wall, tucked back into a place where the canyon bent slightly, and the rock overhung enough to shed rain. A single-room structure, log walls, the corners notched with a precision I recognized before I understood what I was recognizing. The chinking between the logs was moss and clay, dry and intact. A sod roof, partly collapsed on the north end where snow had loaded it through however many winters, but the south end still whole, still holding. The door was set square in the wall, and it faced the creek, and it was closed. We stood in front of it for a moment that felt longer than it was. The latch was a hand-carved oak peg, fitted through a wooden staple on the inside and poking out through a small hole bored in the door itself. A simple thing, the kind of latch a man makes when he expects to come back and finds no reason to use iron. I reached up and worked the peg free. The door swung inward on leather hinges, and the smell came out at me, like a hand pressed flat against my chest. Pine resin, iron filings, the particular dusty sweetness of shaved hardwood, and I stopped breathing entirely. The smell held me at the threshold for a long moment. Then I stepped inside. The light was going. October light in a slot canyon doesn't linger. It falls off a cliff edge all at once. And we had maybe 40 minutes before the interior went fully dark. I didn't waste them. He moved to the right, I moved to the left. We worked the way we always worked when something mattered, without speaking, without dividing the task aloud. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I began to count. A workbench ran the length of the south wall, made from two split-log slabs on upright rounds, and above it, on wooden pegs driven into the log wall, hung 11 tools in a row. A draw knife, 2 chisels, narrow and wide, a folding rule, closed, a hand brace with 4 bits socketed beside it in a wooden rack someone had built specifically for that purpose, a farrier's hammer, its face worn bright from use, a spoke shave, a marking gauge, the stem set at some measurement its owner had chosen and never changed, a froe, its blade dark with old oil, each handle burned with the same 2 letters, TV, small, careful, deliberate. The burning had been done with a fine point, not a blunt brand, done by someone who took time over it. I stood in front of them for a moment longer than was useful. Against the north wall, under the collapsed section of the roof where snow had buckled the sod, there was a structure I could not immediately name, a heavy frame of squared timber, 6 feet tall and perhaps 8 feet long, with wooden gear teeth roughed into a wheel that leaned against the wall beside it. Cross members, iron fittings at 3 points. The whole thing held a skeleton's logic. I could see it was a mechanism, could feel the intention in it, but I couldn't yet read what it intended. Whatever it was not finished. Maybe half of what it meant to be. On the workbench, in a nest of pale shavings that had dried and curled like paper, lay a spoke, half-shaped, one end tapered, the other still square. The draw knife would have finished it in 20 minutes. The shavings beneath it were the color of fresh wood. Looking at that, spoke in its nest, I had the unwilling thought that the man had simply stepped outside for a moment, had set the work down to go and check the creek level, or to stretch his back, or to look at the light. That thought settled somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. He was crouched at the far corner, the northeast, running his hand along the floor planks, checking for rot, I thought. Then his boot came down on one at an angle, and the far end rose. He looked at me, he worked his fingers under the edge, and lifted the plank clear, and in the space beneath it, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept nearly everything out, was a leather journal. He set the journal on the workbench beside the half-shaped spoke, and neither of us spoke for a moment. The oilcloth had done its work well. The leather was dark with age and handling, but the cover had not warped, and when I unwrapped it fully, the pages did not stick or crumble at the edges. I could smell the tallow from our single candle and the cold stone of the canyon wall, and, underneath both, something fainter, linseed oil, worked into old leather by a hand I had not held in 18 months. My brother was asleep before the candle had burned a quarter inch. He lay on his side near the south wall, one blanket beneath him and one across, and his breathing slowed in the way it does when the cold and the walking finally collect their debt. I sat on the low stool at the workbench and opened the journal to the first page. April 11th, 1873. A Tuesday. The handwriting was exact and compact. Not beautiful, but disciplined in the way a man is disciplined when he has learned that sloppiness costs him material. He had surveyed the creek in the first 3 days. Each entry read more like a field ledger than a diary. April 13th. Cascade drop at Upper Fork, measured by plumb line at 4 feet 2 inches. Flow in spring melt, sufficient to drive a wheel of 6-foot diameter at useful speed. Will recalculate after snowmelt recedes. April 17th. Felled 1 ponderosa, 18 inches at base, 40 feet usable length. Required 3 hours. Heel spur still troubling on uneven ground. He had numbered each felled tree and cross-referenced them to a sketch in the back pages. A rough map of the canyon, with small marks, where each timber had come from, each mark annotated with the species and the date. I turned the pages slowly. The wheel diameter revised twice, settling finally at 6 feet 4 inches after he had watched the snowmelt drop through May. The pit saw frame dimensioned to the inch, with notes on the joinery, half lap at the upper corners, drawboard through tenons at the base, all cut to allow disassembly if the structure needed moving. He had thought about everything a man could think about. He had thought about it in the specific, patient way that does not look like passion from the outside, but is nothing else from the inside. Somewhere past the middle of June, the entries began to change in register. Not dramatically, a man like him would not have allowed a dramatic change, but the frame of what he was writing about expanded, quietly, one entry at a time. June 22. If the wheel runs clean through October, a man could mill enough board feet in one season to trade at Garnet Creek for full winter supplies and have timber left beside. 2 men could do it faster. 3 could do it well. I stopped on that sentence. Read it again. 3 could do it well. I set the journal down on the workbench and looked at the structure for the first time in full daylight. The morning light came down into the canyon at a low angle, striking the wall at the north end where the sod had collapsed. And in that light, the whole shape of the thing became clear to me, in a way it had not the night before. We had arrived in darkness and exhaustion, and found something. Now I was standing in a canyon at roughly 9,000 feet, in the autumn of 1874, looking at a water-driven sawmill that was not finished, but was not far from it either. I opened the journal to the technical drawings. He had used the last 30 pages for them. Each one was done in pencil, with dimensions written out in a careful, small hand. Not an engineer's hand, but a craftsman's, which is a different thing. A craftsman draws what he intends to build, and the drawing carries the intention in every line. I held the first drawing up and turned to face the structure, and I began to read one against the other. The pit saw frame was there, both vertical stanchions, the upper and lower cross members, the mortises already cut for the saw carriage guides. I could see the half-lap joints at the upper corners. Clean work, exactly as the drawing specified. The drawboard through tenons at the base were cut and dry-fitted, but not yet pinned. He had left the pins on the workbench, 4 of them, already shaped and tapered, waiting. The frame was sound. Everything in it was sound. What was missing was the water wheel, the tension saw, and the sluice gate. I walked out of the workshop and followed the creek upstream toward the cascade. It was 40 yards, maybe 45. The drop was just over 4 feet. I could see the lip of the upper shelf, the way the water broke white over it and collected in a smooth pool below. He had noted it in the journal. 4 feet 2 inches at late summer flow, likely stronger in May through July. A 6-foot 4-wheel sitting in that pool, fitted with paddles, would turn under sufficient pressure for the full milling season. I stood at the edge of the pool and felt the cold coming off the water. The drawings for the wheel were the most detailed in the journal. Spoke count, paddle depth, hub diameter, the specific half-inch iron strap he had specified for binding the rim. Everything was there. The sluice gate was 2 pages after that, dimensioned to control the flow and protect the wheel in high water. I walked back to the workshop. My brother was standing in the doorway, watching me. I told him the mechanism was sound, that everything existing was well built and everything remaining was drawn out in exact dimensions, that with the tools on this bench and the timber from this canyon, it was finishable. He looked at me for a moment, then he asked how long. I told him I didn't know yet, but that we needed to stay long enough to find out. We stayed. That was the whole of the decision. No ceremony to it, no formal agreement between us. My brother went back inside and began pulling the collapsed sod from the north end of the roof, and I picked up the draw knife from the bench and followed him out, and that was that. 3 weeks of work before we allowed ourselves to read much further. The roof came first because it had to. 2 of the rafters on the north end had given under the weight of an early snow, and without them, Sound the workshop was just a place to sleep cold and wet. We felled 2 straight-grained firs from the slope above the canyon, neither of them more than 8 inches at the base, which I could drop without a crosscut saw, and squared them with the axe until they seated clean in the original notches. Then we stripped bark and laid new poles across them, packed the gaps with pine duff and packed sod over that. 3 days of work. On the 4th morning, I pressed my palm flat against the interior ceiling and felt nothing move. Firewood was next. The canyon had no shortage of deadfall, but deadfall in a slot canyon at 9,000 feet is not the same as wood you can trust through a hard winter. We split and stacked for 8 days, working in shifts, and by the end of it, the south wall of the canyon held a cord and a half of split fir, covered with oilskin, weighted down with stones. My shoulders were stiff for a week. In the evenings we read. The journal's early entries were technical: measurements, material notes, small frustrations with the wheel hub's iron fitting that he'd had to re-drill twice. But somewhere in the 2nd week of September in the record, the voice changed. Shorter sentences, more sky in them. He wrote about the canyon at dusk, the way the light came through the slot at a low angle and turned the creek the color of old copper. He wrote that he intended to bring us here in the spring. He used our names without introduction, the way a man writes to himself when he is already speaking to someone in his mind. He wrote that the younger one would love the sound the wheel would make when it first turned, and that the older one would stand over the completed frame and not say a word, and that would be enough. I read those passages slowly, sometimes twice. I did not read them aloud. On the evening of the 19th day, a Thursday, the 2nd week of November, I turned to the entry dated the 3rd of September, 1873. The page had a different weight to it. The handwriting was spaced wider, more deliberate, as if he had set the pen down once before beginning. At the top of the page he had written 2 names: ours. I closed the journal and set it on the bench and did not open it again that night. That night I left the journal where it was and lay on my blanket with my eyes open. The fire had burned to coals. I could hear the creek moving in the dark, steady and indifferent, the way water always sounds when everything else has gone quiet. I did not sleep much. In the morning I rose before my brother and put wood on the coals and stood at the window hole. We had not yet covered it with oilskin, and watched the gray light come up through the slot of the canyon. The stone walls held the cold, the way stone does, slow to release it. Frost on the workbench, frost on the handles of the tools. He woke and we ate, and did not speak about the journal, and did not speak about much of anything. I had not yet told him about the final entry. There are some things you delay not from cowardice, but because you understand that once the words are said, the moment before them is gone. I wanted one more morning without that knowledge being shared between us. He went to fetch water from the upper cascade. He took the 2 tin pails and the hand axe in case there was ice at the edge of the pool. He was gone longer than the task required. I knew it when 20 minutes became 30, and 30 became close to an hour. I did not go looking. I waited at the workbench with a chisel in my hand, pretending to work, not working. When he came back, he set the pails down just inside the door. He did not say anything right away. He stood with his coat still buttoned and his hat still on, which he never kept on indoors. His face was the same as always from a distance, but his jaw was set in a way I recognized, the way he held himself when he was deciding whether something was real. He said, "There's a cairn, 200 yards up, flat stone on top. The letters are his." I set the chisel down. Neither of us said anything more that day. I don't know how to explain it, except to say that the silence was not empty. It had weight. We moved around each other in the workshop with the careful attention of men who understand that the other one is carrying something and that setting it down will take time. We built up the fire, we ate, we lay down. In the morning, he was already at the bench when I woke. The light outside was still more dark than gray. I could hear him by sound before I could see him. The small scrape of a marking gauge along a board, measured twice, then marked. I rose and pulled on my coat and took my place beside him, and neither of us mentioned it, and we began. The journal described ash. It said to look for a stand of it 300 yards east of the workshop, in the hollow where the canyon widened and a seep of groundwater kept the soil dark year-round. We went out the next morning before full light, and we found it. Young trees, slim-trunked, the bark smooth and gray-green in the way ash bark is when the tree hasn't yet thickened into plates. My brother counted 11 of them. Enough. We cut 8 lengths and hauled them back in 2 trips, the wood heavy with water still in it, the grain tight and fine. The journal was specific. Green timber for the spokes, not dry. Dry would split under the torque of moving water. The wheel needed flex in it, enough to give without cracking, and only green ash bent without breaking. He had written that sentence twice, once in the entry, and once again in the margin beside the drawing, underlined. The wheel was 7 feet in diameter, 16 spokes. Each one had to taper, thicker at the hub mortise, narrowing toward the rim, and the taper had to be consistent, or the wheel would run uneven and shake itself apart inside a season. The spoke shave came off its hook, the draw knife, the froe for the first rough split from the round, each tool in the order he had specified. I split the first length with the froe and a mallet, following the grain. The wood opened cleanly, the smell of it sharp and green and cold. Then the draw knife for roughing, pulling toward me in long strokes, the shavings curling off the bench and catching in the draft from the fire. Then the spoke shave for the final taper, checking with the folding rule at each stage, the measurement written in the journal to the 1/8 of an inch, in his handwriting, in the careful numerals he used for anything that had to be right. The first spoke took most of a morning. I understood by midday why he had never finished, not because the work was beyond him, because the work was enormous in its exactness, and he had been doing it alone. My brother took the froe for the second length. I showed him the measurement, showed him where to check, and he nodded, and didn't ask twice. He was slower than me at first, then less slow. By the third spoke his shavings were coming off the same length as mine. There was a quality to that work I have never found a word for. The journal told us what to do, and we did it. And in doing it, we were not alone in the way we had been for 18 months. Every measurement confirmed, every taper matched. When I held a finished spoke up to the light and sighted down it and found it true, I felt, not grief exactly, not comfort exactly, something that contained both, the way a door frame contains the space of what has passed through it. We finished 4 spokes before dark. We worked through the wheel hub for most of the first 2 weeks of November. The hub was the hardest single piece in the whole frame, a cylinder of dense oak, 8 inches across, with 8 mortises cut at equal intervals around its circumference, each one receiving a spoke at an angle my father had calculated to within a 1/4 degree. I know that now because the journal said so. 18 degrees of inward cant. He had worked it out over 3 pages, the numbers crowding each other, a sketch redrawn twice with measurements revised in a smaller hand each time, as though he was narrowing in on something he couldn't quite see until he did. My brother held the hub steady while I chiseled. That was most of it, holding it steady. A hub that shifts when the mortise is being cut ruins the angle, and a ruined angle means the wheel runs eccentric, and an eccentric wheel tears itself apart under load. My father had known this. He had built a cradle of split birch to hold the hub level. A small thing, took him maybe an hour to make, but without it, the work would have been guesswork. Every tool he left was a thought made physical. I kept finding that. It was a Wednesday, mid-November, the 14th or 15th. I had lost the exact count and recalculated by going back 3 Sundays in my head and stepping forward from there. The light was low already by early afternoon. I was fitting the third spoke into its mortise, testing the angle with his folding rule, when I went to push the door a half-inch more open for better light. The door caught. It always caught slightly on the frame, the wood having swelled and settled unevenly over a year and more of freeze and thaw. I pressed it back and something fell from the upper notch of the frame. The one I had seen and assumed was a channel cut to seat the door latch hardware. A folded square of paper, stiff as dried leather, dropped straight down and landed on the threshold. I picked it up. The fold lines were white where the paper had cracked along them. I opened it without thinking, the way you open something that has fallen. La Plata County Land Office, claim number 7714, 40 acres. His name, printed in the county clerk's hand, Thomas Voss and heirs, filed August 14, 1873. I read it a second time, then a third. My brother didn't know yet. He was still at the hub behind me, the cradle holding it level, doing exactly what I had shown him. I stood in the doorway for a long time with that document in my hands, reading the word heirs, feeling what it meant to own the ground you were standing on. I folded the deed along its cracked lines and put it inside the journal, between the pages for August. I didn't say anything to my brother that evening. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't that I wanted to keep it from him. It was more that I needed to carry it alone for a few hours first, to understand the weight of it before I handed any of it to someone else. That night, after he was asleep, I sat at the workbench with the journal open to the final entry. I had read up to it before, but always stopped a page short, the way you slow before the last mile of a long walk, because once it's done, there's no more road. The candle was burning low. Outside, the canyon was completely still. No wind, no creek sound, the cold having locked everything in place. I turned the page. The entry was dated September 3rd, 1873. The handwriting was smaller than earlier entries, tighter, as though he had known the pages were running out and was measuring himself against them. It did not begin the way I expected. The mortise on the crown post needs to be cut at 7 degrees off square to account for the slope of the bank. I have marked the angle on the post itself in blue chalk. Do not square it. The chalk is wrapped in burlap under the north shelf. He wrote for 2 full pages in that manner. The sequence for hanging the wheel, the correct depth for the pit saw channel, a note about the creek's flow rate in early spring versus late, and which weeks would give the best head of water. He described the alignment of the drive shaft with the attention of a man who had built it 7 times in his mind before building it once with his hands. Not a word about illness, not a word about the months since his last entry. Then, at the bottom of the second page, the handwriting widened slightly, as if he had exhaled. Take the deed from the door frame to Aldous Prentice at Garnet Creek Station. He knows the filing. Finish the wheel. Cut timber before spring. The mountain will feed you if you ask it correctly. Your father said. That was the whole of it. I sat with those lines for a long time. There was no farewell in them, no grief, no apology for what he had not managed to come back from. Just the next step, and the step after, laid out the way he had always laid out any task. as though the only honest answer to love was to make sure the work could be finished without you. The candle burned down to nothing. I didn't light another one. The 14th of February came in clear and cold, the kind of cold that sits still in the air and doesn't move regardless of the sun. We had been in the canyon 97 days. My brother was up before first light. I heard him at the sluice gate, the creak of the timber brace, then silence, then the particular sound of water finding a new path. I dressed without hurrying. I knew what was about to happen, and I found I didn't want to rush it. By the time I reached the wheel, it had already begun to turn. Slowly at first, one paddle catching, then the next, the whole frame shuddering in a way that made my chest tighten until I recognized it as settling. The structure finding its balance under a load it had never carried before. The drive shaft engaged. I heard the pit saw's arm drop against its guide rail, and then the wood, and then the cut. A long, clean tearing sound that rose and held and finally fell away as the blade came through the far end of the pine log. We stood on either side of it and did not speak. The board that came off was rough at the edges and slightly bowed from tension in the heartwood. It was the most useful thing I had ever seen. We loaded the first run of boards onto the hand sledge my brother had built from salvaged wheel spokes and a section of felled aspen. 11 boards in the first 2 hours, enough to show what the mill could produce, enough to carry the 11 miles to the station. We lashed them down with the spare rope and started walking before noon. The snow was knee-deep in the open stretches. My brother pulled. I pushed where the grade tipped against us. We said almost nothing the whole way. Aldous Prentice met us at the door of the trading post, as though he had been half expecting someone. He was a wide, quiet man with a gray beard trimmed short, and hands that had worked outdoors for 30 years. He looked at the lumber on the sledge. He looked at us. Then he asked whose boys we were, and when I told him, he was still for a moment. He had known our father. He said so plainly, without performance. He had helped him file the claim number 7714, 40 acres, August of 1873. He confirmed the deed was valid without being asked. He gave us $47 in supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, rifle cartridges, 2 new candles, a coil of good rope, and a tin of black tea. He registered the deed transfer in a ledger he kept behind the counter, and did not charge us for the filing. We loaded everything onto the sledge and started back before dark. The road back took longer than the road out. The sledge was heavier, and the grade was honest about it. We made camp once, in the open, with a fire that lasted just long enough to warm the beans in the pot. We were back in the canyon by mid-morning of the following day. Spring came the way it always does at that elevation. Not in a rush, but in increments so small you only notice them when you stop and look. The snowpack off the north wall shrank 2 inches in a week, then 4 in the next. The creek ran louder. A pair of Clark's nutcrackers appeared in the spruce above the workshop and stayed. By the first week of April, the upper cascade was running full, and the wheel turned without any coaxing from us at all. We did not leave. There was no discussion about it. One morning, my brother simply marked the first timber for the season's cut, and I set the blade to angle. That was the decision. The deed was filed. The work was in front of us. The canyon had been waiting for someone to stay, and we were the ones who had arrived. On an evening in mid-April, after the day's work was done and the fire was low, I lifted the northeast plank and took out the journal one more time. I did not read the whole of it. I turned to the final entry, where the letter was. I read it the way I always read it now, slowly, not looking for anything new, just listening to it. It ended the same way it always ended. What I have started, you will finish. Not because you have to, because you know how now. That is the only thing I ever wanted to give you. I sat with that for a while. Then I set the journal back beneath the floor, pressed the plank down, and heard the wood settle quiet. If you have watched this far, I want to say something to you plainly. Two pairs of hands can finish what one pair began. That is not a comfort. It is a fact, made of wood and iron and cold water, and the specific weight of a framing hammer at the end of a long day. Whatever your father left in the work he did, in the joinery of a house, in the way he held a tool, in a decision he made before you were old enough to ask him why, it is still there. It does not require him to be present to remain true. The things the mountains keep in their abandoned workshops, their unmarked graves, their plans folded inside door frames, they are waiting for the right pair of hands to come down the trail. If something was left behind for you, I would like to hear about it in the comments. And if this story meant something, please share it with someone who would understand why.